Hey, it's Mr. Keys, and today we're going to talk about using neighbor tones. Neighbor tones are notes that are next to a chord's root note. We need to review a couple of things so that this makes sense. First, let's review the major scale for the key of C major. The notes are C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and then it repeats again, C, D, E, F, G, etc. We'll be using the scale of the key that we're playing in to help us figure out the neighbor tones for each chord. In this case, we're using C major. Let's go through all of the chords of C major, figure out the roots, which we already know from previous videos, and then determine what their neighbor tones are. Here's the one chord, C, E, G. The root would be C, and the neighbor tones are D and B. We call D the upper neighbor and B the lower neighbor. If we look at the major scale, D and B are both in the scale, and that's where we'll be getting our neighbor tones from, well, at least for now. The 2 chord, D minor, has D as the root, its upper neighbor is E, and its lower neighbor is C. The 3 chord, or E minor, has E as the root, F as an upper neighbor, D as a lower neighbor. The 4 chord, FAC, or F major, has F as the root, G as the upper neighbor, and E as the lower neighbor. Our 5 chord, or G major, its notes are G, B, D, its root is G, upper neighbor is A, lower neighbor is F. The 6 chord is ACE, otherwise known as A minor. The root is A, upper neighbor is B, and lower neighbor is G. And the last chord, the 7 chord, which is B diminished, its root is B, upper neighbor is C, and lower neighbor is A. The following beat is a 2-bar phrase repeated twice, and it has the following chords. Let's write the notation. We're in 4/4. We have F major, A minor, E minor, and back to F major. Each chord is 2 beats. Let's look at how we can use neighbor tones to embellish our bass line. When we think about this sort of technique, we need to think about where we're going, not where we are. Let's take a look at the first 2 chords. So normally I'd play F for 2 and then A for 2. So it'd sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. But we're going to embellish the A by sticking a note right before we get to A. Now, we still need to get to the A minor on beat 3, but we're going to borrow some time for F to get this done. So the upper neighbor of A minor, or the bass note A, would be B. So let's stick that in before. I'll stick it in using an 8th note. So here we go. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. So notice how the B borrows some time from the F and leads us right to A minor. I'm going to do upper neighbors for each of the chords. So it would be 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. We have to make sure that the chord that we're going to comes in at the right time. It can't come late and it can't come early. So that means the upper neighbor or lower neighbor, whatever we're using, has to come slightly before. Let's take a look at some examples. For the first example, I'm going to do upper neighbors before every chord with the beat. Here we go. So if we take a look down here, we can see when the upper neighbors for each chord comes in. They come in slightly before the chord changes. Now we know that chords change every 2 beats, so you can see how the upper neighbor is borrowing time from the chord before. So here's F. We borrow a little bit of time to stick in the upper neighbor to get to A. A comes right on B3. The next chord is going to be E minor, and we borrow a little bit of time from A to stick in the upper neighbor to get to E minor. Then we borrow a little bit of time from E minor to stick in the upper neighbor to get to F major. And then the same thing continues on and on and on. In this next example, we're going to use 16th notes to get there. So if we look down here in the editor window again, we can see that now our upper neighbor is much shorter. It's only a 16th note value, and that goes for all of them. So we're borrowing less time this time. In this next example, I'm going to play the upper neighbor twice instead of just once. Okay, so I'm using 16th notes down there, as you can see. Let's take a look at another example. This time, we're going to use lower neighbors. So the rhythm that I used for the lower neighbor was an 8th note, and you can see how it's borrowing some time. And here's the lower neighbor to A minor, here's the lower neighbor to E minor, and then the lower neighbor to F major again as the pattern repeats itself. Let's do lower neighbors again as 16th notes. All right, so that sounds pretty good. Let's do double lower neighbors this time. Take a look at the rhythm that I used for the lower neighbors. They take up 3/4 of a beat. Here's where the next beat starts. So they start after the first quarter of beat 2, and they kind of go down like that every single time. It's an interesting pattern. Let's take a look at another example where we're going to alternate between upper neighbors and lower neighbors. So in that example, I started with an upper neighbor, then I did a lower neighbor, then I did an upper neighbor, then lower neighbor, then upper neighbor, with some mistakes there, then a lower neighbor, then an upper neighbor. Let's do the reverse now. Lower neighbors first, then upper neighbors, and we'll alternate like that. So we can see down here, we have our lower neighbor to A, then our upper neighbor to E, then our lower neighbor to F, and it kind of continues on like that. So this last example is going to be the craziest example. I'm going to put together all the techniques that we've learned so far. So octaves, fifths, upper neighbors, and lower neighbors. Here we go. started with a fifth for my first chord. Then I went back to the root, and then I put the lower neighbor in to get to A. From here, I went straight, without any lower neighbors or upper neighbors, fifths or octaves, straight down to E, where I played its fifth, went back to the root, played the upper neighbor to get to F this time, and then the lower neighbor to get to F, followed by a fifth and an octave, back down to the upper neighbor to get to A minor, A minor, A minor, A minor, and then the upper neighbor to get to E minor, the fifth of E minor, back to its root, which is also the lower neighbor, to F. And then I finished like that. So in conclusion, we've learned a bunch of different techniques. We've learned octaves, fifths, upper neighbors, and lower neighbors. I'm not saying that you should use them all the time, because that would be just a little bit crazy. You should use them in places where your bass note is getting stagnant and needs a little bit more energy. Be creative and have fun.